It will be clear to anyone who's made their way through Abdul-Rahman Abdullah's exhibition here at John Curtin Gallery that animals play a significant role in the artist's imagination. The work that gives the exhibition its title, Everything is True, one of the first pieces you encounter is a gold-painted bronze statue of a triceratops, something your eye might be drawn to and your heart might even leap at if, like myself, you grew up on the paleontological imagination of Jurassic Park and the Transformers Dinobots. Although your instinctive arachnophobia is perhaps more overwhelming than your nostalgic dinophilia, you might be more likely to respond to the giant spider poised here ominously and perhaps portentously above this door. Among Monsters, the piece is titled. We know we can see what awaits any figure who might walk through it. We might prepare ourselves to warn them, but of what? For it seems to me that this huntsman is not entirely sinister. With the finely crafted detail of its legs and body, it's just as much a herald for something prodigious or uncanny, something otherwise than things as they stand, something in the margins, something strange and, like the dinosaur, true. It is clear just from these initial works that animals figure heavily in Abdullah's visual language, that they have captured his imagination and put it to work for their ends. If you warily or curiously turn the corner and make your way through the gallery, many more creatures await you. Cats, snakes, dogs, buffalo, sheep, doves, rays. They belong not only to many species, but to many domains of life, occupying various niches in the city or in the mind. Each animal, most often posed together with a familiar domestic object such as a chandelier or a carpet, tells its own story, evokes its own particular matrix of affect and memory, from suburban fear to nationalistic xenophobia to iconographic legend to shimmering grief. These are at times intensely personal images infused with the dreamlike quality that draw on the artist's emotions and experiences. At the same time, they're culturally embedded in Australian suburbiana and the everyday contours of how we share our lives with non-human animals. Animals have, of course, long been a key subject that artists have drawn, painted, carved, and performed, whether delineated in realistic shape, transfigured into symbol and metaphor, or defigured to evoke the abject body and lively matter. Numerous art critics and theorists have reflected on the centrality of animals to prehistoric, historical, and contemporary art, and the main modes in which they are enrolled and unleashed. You can find many coffee table books, such as Kenneth Clark's Animals and Men, that explore with typically patriarchal language and humanistic commitments their relationship as reflected in Western art from prehistory to the present day, as the book's subtitle puts it. The history of animal art here ranges from sacred and symbolic animals, animals observed, the beauty and energy of animals, and animals beloved, to animals destroyed, covering forms from ancient hieroglyphics to medieval bestiaries to Renaissance and modern schools of painting. This book, which was published in support of the aims and activities of the World Wildlife Fund, of course ends with an elegiac tone, mourning the loss of nature in the face of industrial destruction. We love animals, we watch them with delight, we study their habits with ever-increasing curiosity, and we destroy them, Clark writes. We have sacrificed them to the gods, we have killed them in arenas in order to enjoy a cruel excitement, we still hunt them and we slaughter them by the million out of greed. Still, Clark holds out hope that while we can never recapture the golden age where man and animal lived in a supposed harmony, nonetheless, we can regain that feeling of kinship, which will help us establish a feeling of the unity of creation. Animal art is here subsumed into a lament for lost contact and connection, where the assumed we of humanity's craving for an assumed dignity and purity of animal nature has been squandered through our own selfish and greedy, one could almost say sinful, actions. Such humanistic narratives, of course, persist, but within the last few decades, there's been a distinct movement of artists, critics, and theorists of a more postmodern and post-humanist persuasion who've drawn on the concepts and methods articulated within the field of animal studies to explore animality, embodiment, difference, and becoming. One of the key insights of this interdisciplinary field has been to recognise the asinine and harebrained stupidity of the concept of animal itself as a single category, opposed to the singularity of the human, a concept that violently covers and encloses, as Jacques Derrida puts it, the heterogeneous multiplicity of the living, as if one could use a single term to refer to the vastly different beings that inhabit the world, as if there were not an infinite space that separates the lizard from the dog and the protozoan from the dolphin, and his menagerie goes on. These animals differ from one another not only in anatomy, but in terms of behaviour, intelligence, sociality, and communication, displaying varied playful and creative capabilities that scientific research has demonstrated they possess, but that were once thought solely to be the province of the human. But the difference and multiplicity of animality that we must learn to properly recognise is not only biological and phenomenological. It is, as many animal studies scholars have argued, also cultural, historical, and institutional. Animals play many roles for us, occupy numerous sites, are engaged in various types of relationships with human beings, and their escalating methods of organising and transforming life, whether experimented upon in labs, exhibited in zoos, trained in kennels, raised on farms, slaughtered in abattoirs, whether pets, kept as family members, or endangered species managed in wildlife parks. And one of the achievements of animal studies has been to draw attention to these forms of material and cultural difference that also shape the lives of animals today. Thus, often when contemporary artists have engaged with animal studies, and when scholars and critics have drawn from this field to analyse and indeed to think with contemporary art, it has been in recognition of this vast field of different yet mutually constitutive life forms. Their works have sought to challenge the hierarchy set up between human and animal, to subvert or to explode the anthropocentrism that historically shaped animals as mere symbols, to undermine the dualism that divides the human mind or spirit and its rich worlds of meaning and freedom from mechanical animal bodies and their impoverished worlds of need and captivation. Works have sought to question whether art is indeed a uniquely human undertaking, or whether and how animals might share in this creative activity, and to expose the ethical flaws of how animals are treated in contemporary society, and indeed in various art practices. Exploring themes of corporeality and becoming, fragility and exposure, worlding and violence, creativity and play, post-human art, as Steve Baker puts it, treats animals as creatures who actively share the more than human world with humans, rather than as mere symbols or metaphors for aspects of the so-called human condition. Amanda Boetzkers writes in her entry on art in the recent Edinburgh Companion to Animal Studies volume that contemporary art charts an ethical terrain in which artists foreground the ontological difference between human and non-human animals, the metaphysical deadlock of a shared mortality, the emergence of modalities of care and companionship, and articulations of coexistence in difference. Contemporary artists, she writes, strive to generate a new form of umwelt, or surrounding world, in which art becomes a passage between human and non-human animal meaning. Examples of such contemporary animal art include works in which animals themselves participate in paintings or performances or installations or galleries, as well as works in which art objects are incorporated into situated ecologies. Pictured here, Joseph Boyes' How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, and Kathy Hy's Embracing Animal, in which lab rats were exhibited and cared for as an art project. Also Wilson and Snape Bjornsdottir's Polar Bear Habitats. This contemporary animal art poses distinctive questions. What are the barriers between human and animal, and how can they be overcome? What distinctive meanings do animal bodies express, and what sort of affects do they transmit? While Abdul-Rahman Abdullah does not engage explicitly with this particular discourse, the centrality of animals to his work, the ways in which they address and capture us, does prompt us to consider the animal figures that populate his art, and the meditative, memorial and dreamlike scenes that they stage. How might they help us to reconsider the significance of animality? The title of this talk, Why Carved Animals, responds to that of one of the most influential works of criticism in this area, John Berger's essay, Why Look at Animals. This piece is included in his collection about looking, but was originally published in the magazine New Society in 1977 in a series of 3 essays, whose titles nicely summarise his argument. Animals as Metaphor, Vanishing Animals, and Why Zoos Disappoint. For Berger, who we are as human beings, our self-understanding and identity, indeed our very capacity for language and art, emerges out of our proximity to animals and our encounter with their gaze. Societies throughout history have always lived in close contact with the animals that they rely on for both food and meaning, meat and metaphor. They were subjected and worshipped, bred and sacrificed, he writes, emphasising the and. But, Berger argues, modern socio-economic changes led to a thorough and regrettable transformation, removing animals from public space and everyday life and resulting in their and our alienation and marginalisation. Beasts of burden and slaughterhouses were expelled from urban centres, cars replaced horses, and wildlife were pushed further into the countryside, species were exploited and driven to extinction. Ironically, this distanciation and invisibility of animals was accompanied by a proliferation of animal images. They survived in sayings, dreams, games, stories, superstitions, the language itself, he says, and further multiplied in toys, films, cartoons, and other commercial imagery. Yet for Berger, the great variety of animal images with which modern consumers are surrounded really only repeats and perpetuates the disappearance and marginalisation of living animals from everyday life. He concludes with an analysis of zoological gardens, which might seem to offer a chance at this otherwise lost animal contact, but in fact, he argues, can only disappoint, as the animals whose gaze we seek, but who never return it, are irredeemably marginalised. He writes, public zoos came into existence at the beginning of the period which was to see the disappearance of animals from daily life. The zoo to which people go to meet animals, to observe them, to see them, is in fact a monument to the impossibility of such encounters. Modern zoos are an epitaph to a relationship which was as old as man. While his argument touches on a number of further examples, it is this image of disappointment that is at its core. The question worth answering is that of most visitors. Why are these animals less than I believed? The zoo visitor is dissatisfied, not, he argues, because the animal is alive and recalcitrant, but because it has been rendered absolutely marginal, not metaphysically, but socially, economically, and historically. Zoos do not compensate for, but demonstrate that marginalisation. Everywhere animals disappear, he writes. In zoos, they constitute the living monument to their own disappearance. Berger's argument has had a mixed history of both support and suspicion. One of its most interesting inheritors is Akira Mizuta-Lippert, who opens his study of the spectral quality of animals in modernity titled Electric Animal with this epigraph from Berger: everywhere animals disappear. Through a range of examples from philosophy, literature, and film, he proceeds to radicalise Berger's notion of animals' physical disappearance and imagistic proliferation. While animals were disappearing from the immediate world, they were reappearing in the mediated world of technological reproduction, he argues. Animals have found a proper habitat or world in the recording devices of the technological media. The capacities of the technological media in general, photographic media in particular, to record and recall served as a anemic supplement that allowed modern culture to preserve animals. Numerous other animal studies scholars have perpetuated their own version of this narrative. The profusion of animal images and art only perpetuates their disappearance. What forms of real-life encounter with animals we do still have, from pet keeping and zoos to urban wildlife and ecotourism, are seen as inescapably inauthentic and empty, and animals in art and media are seen as undead spectres that haunt our nostalgia for this lost primary contact. Others have criticised Berger's arguments, such as Jonathan Burt, the editor of Reaction Books' fascinating animal series, who offers a close reading of what he calls Berger's overstated and simplistic thesis in the way that it ahistorically romanticizes peasant life and privileges the textual or linguistic animal over the visual, thus missing some of what is most interesting and vital about contemporary phenomena, from factory farm expose footage to wildlife critter cams to internet cat videos. As Annette Pig puts it in her own response titled "Why Not Look at Animals?", meaningful distinction should be drawn instead not between real and virtual, but between the kinds of relationships that differently culturally mediated encounters encode, and the logic of domination that cuts across embodied, linguistic, and visual encounters alike. And complicating this narrative of marginalisation has likewise been a major concern in my own research. The impacts of habitat destruction, geographical exclusion, regimes of visibility, and industries of animal use and food production are undeniable. Yet the encounters with animality that persist in urban and suburban life are not only characterised by alienation and marginalisation. Indeed, modernity can be seen as in many ways having deepened, accelerated, and intensified the arenas of contact and of mutual transformation between humans and animals. Indeed, as having produced new and singular ways of being and of being together, what Dominique Lastel calls hybrid communities of humans, animals, and machines that share meaning, interests, and affects. Moreover, analysing cultural productions of animal images only in terms of such marginalisation obscures so much of what such art stages for our reflection and experience. Far from trapping us across an abyss from our lost animal kin, contemporary works most often seek to produce a zone of contact or encounter, an world through which we might further cultivate our own animality and our relationship to that of others. What if, rather than focusing on irretrievable loss and the unreturnable gaze, we emphasise the plurality, the relationality, and the futurity of animality? Instead of beginning from the difference and distance between humans and animals, from a gap that must but cannot be broached, a radical otherness that is inaccessible and necessarily closed off, what if we begin from shared life, from hybrid community, from the assumption of zones of continued conflicted contact? To do so might help us to recognise the proliferation of new and singular ways of being between humans and animals that occur in the margins of this modern marginalisation. So it's from this perspective that I want to approach the work of Abdul-Rahman Abdullah. I'm not an art critic, but a philosopher, and so my concern is not to interpret or analyse the works, but to think with them, to articulate some ways in which the scenes his pieces stage can open up new pathways into comprehending today's diverse and troubled animalities. So if after this talk perhaps you make your way past the optimistic dinosaur and the portentous spider and turn the corner to enter the enclosed gallery, you will come across a work entitled "The Day the World Stood Still," in which a black cat with fine whiskers and prominent ears is curled up against beneath a dimly lit lampshade, its eyes closed, its paw resting gently on its tail. The placement of the sleeping and dreaming cat at this point in the exhibition seems significant, as if it is a portal through which one travels to enter the rest of the dreamscape. If I wanted to perform some academic wordplay, I'd speak of feline oneirology, the study of cat dreams, but I'm a dog person, and only versed in the twitches and wheezes of canine dreams of running and stick chasing. I'll have to leave it up to the cat people to share their observations of feline sleeping behaviour. Nonetheless, I want to insist on this element of the work. It gives shape and presence to animal fantasy. It is not only a representation, a figure or symbol drawn from our mythological imagination or our cultural bestiary, it is a figure of animal figuration, of the animal's own dream work and fantasy. As soon as you turn to the right, you know you're in a dream, as a colourful snake is curled upon a hall stand, not quite poised to strike, but nonetheless directly facing you and addressing you as you enter. The multicoloured scales, purple and pink and orange and yellow and green, snake dream contrasts with those of another snake sculpture that immediately follows it. a large, purely white one with creamy eyes, resting on a white sheepskin rug, curled upon itself in a more active way that suggests a slow uncoiling. Its title, To Dream a Good Luck Dream, indicates not only that we are still occupied with the oniric, serpentine this time, but also with that something more is at stake. How might we dream of animals? How we dream of animals and how we dream of animal dreams bear on our own fortune and theirs as well. We pass by two human figures, a bust of the artist's father and a shrouded figure of a little ghost, before turning the corner to be confronted by three remarkable works. One features a black dog laying on a long rug with a small golden snake curled over it. The gazes of both dog and snake are directed to the same object, alert to a noise or disturbance. On the wall we find waiting, watching, a cat whose half-bodied figure is only complete visually by the mirror that it stands against. Further along, again on the floor rug, is a large buffalo, an extraordinary 2.5-metre waxwood sculpture titled The Obstacle, that emerges at shoulder and hip height from the floor as if from water or another dimension. From the entangled and halved and hidden bodies of these creatures, we move on to In the Name, a series of 3 silicon carcasses hanging from the ceiling by galvanized steel chains and meat hooks in an enclosed, brightly lit space. The detail of the fat and flesh is so remarkable that when I first walked through the exhibit at the opening, someone asked if the carcasses were real. This stuffed meat is at once abject and ordinary. The artist has spoken of the work's origins in his memories of his father's backyard halal slaughter, a practice that we might believe with Berger is no longer part of everyday experience, which it isn't, of course, except for those who happen to work or live on farms, surrounded by the lives and deaths of animals raised for food, as it turns out Abdul-Rahman Abdullah happens to do. On entering the final hallway, we come across practical magic, a small camel. Once again, its face and fur captured in wood in exquisite detail, with an extremely long rope tied to its neck and then curled around it in dozens of concentric loops. We move from slaughter to domestication, structured by technologies of control and power, but nonetheless making possible a magical thread of connection and elaboration. The next work combines the violence and enchantment of the previous two. In I've been assured you'll go to heaven, my friend, a white sheep is pinned up against the wall, its legs tied with a white ribbon, the nearby wall spotted by a last evacuation of its bowels. We pass the language of birds, in which 2 birds are seated on rugs, a reference to the parliament of the birds and its connection of the everyday noise that we hear on a daily basis from the trees to the language spoken by jinns and angels. It's a language, the artist said in reflecting on this encounter, in which birds are talking about us, clearly, but which we can't entirely access or decipher. A world not entirely for us, but nonetheless tied together in an experience. We then come upon the dogs, 3 vicious-looking and very large black dogs, their bared teeth carved in fine detail, moving forward menacingly, yet poised beneath 25 chandeliers that, while they hang below head height, still allow space to walk among the fierce dog pack. And likewise immersive is the culminating piece, Pretty Beach, a meditation on his grandfather's suicide, in which a school of stingrays glide beneath rain composed of innumerable shimmering waist-high crystals. One emerges from the gallery as if from a dream and sees again the dimly lit black cat of the day the world stood still asleep at the end of the passage, and you wonder if you've been walking through her dreams this whole time. Abdullah's works are just such dreams, worlds stood still, in which he situates the audience within a shimmering scene, at once frozen and dynamic, tactile and yet untouchable, a memory or experience or vision occupied by animal figures serving as avatar or oracle. Importantly, the animals that he carves are not wild but domestic and familiar, animals one might encounter in everyday life. These scenes emerge from the troubling complexity of our own familial and institutional relations to animals. They are scenes of death and killing, of coercion and control, of fear and grief, but also of peace and tranquility, of mystery and fantasy. These works thus aid us in pushing back ever so slightly against Berger's narrative of irretrievable loss. Berger characterises the gaze between humans and animals in an interesting and enigmatic way. The animal scrutinises him, that is man, he writes, across a narrow abyss of non-comprehension. But this was nonetheless a meaningful incomprehensibility that situated human beings from the perspective of the strange others that surround them, that provided a companionship, he writes, offered to the loneliness of the human being as a species. It is this ambiguous gaze of familiar but distinct creatures, like and yet unlike humans, that according to Berger's argument has disappeared in modernity, along with the animals who once offered it. But in providing us with opportunities for meditation on confrontations and encounters with animals, by inviting us into their dreams, the work of Abdul-Rahman Abdullah carves out for us an animality that is not irredeemably disappeared, forever marginalised, not one in which images can only try and fail to replace and compensate for the loss of real animal contact. What he sculpts is instead a multifaceted and conflicted zone where all sorts of ways of being with and alongside animals are staged, where their continued confronting and transformative presence calls us into a more thoughtful, more attentive way of relating to them. I might even say, more awake because more deeply dreaming. Now, this might seem an altogether too flighty and speculative daydream to offer us much towards understanding animal art. I hope to go some way towards justifying it, or at least making it slightly less preposterous, by offering up a few final bits of data from the domain of zoos, animals, art and dreaming, a few tales from the margins of animal marginalisation and figuration, one from the artist's own experience, one from the history of art in zoos, and one from the work of a zoo biologist fascinated with animal dreams. The first is this. I was intrigued to learn in reading an online interview that for a period in the mid-2000s before becoming a full-time artist, Abdul-Rahman spent some time working as a commercial sculptor at the Perth Zoo. He was kind enough to speak to me a little about his experience working at the zoo and its relation to his subsequent art practice. Working for a company hired by the zoo to produce art and build enclosures, Abdullah's work in this domain involved not only creating sculptures of animals such as bears, lizards and elephants that would be placed around the zoo grounds, as well as contributing to the construction of the rainforest exhibit, wombat tunnel, reptile house and crocodile enclosure, but also a range of activities such as using 3D modelling that drew on extended periods of animal observation. In particular, he spoke of an occasion when he was tasked with taking a mould of a dead elephant's foot that would be used as a training aid to teach keepers how to clean the animal's toes. Clearly, this experience up close with Australian and so-called exotic animals, who he was able to observe, interact with, digitally model, and physically touch and mould from, was influential in shaping the visual and tactile modalities of his later animal sculptures. With this work, Abdullah also gained a different vantage on the forms of contact between keepers and animals that is otherwise unavailable to the average zoogoer. In the behind-the-scenes attachments formed between keepers and the animals, including those on quarantine and not on display, without the presence of visitors, a domain is opened up that belies Berger's narrative of the impossibility of animal encounter. In my own research on the anecdotes and stories of zookeepers confirm that it is here, away from the theatre of exhibition, that much of what is most interesting about the zoo occurs. For Berger, the zoo is a demonstration of the relations between man and animals, nothing else. But there are many forms of relation and many margins within animals' marginalisation. Of course, the connection between the art world and zoological gardens such as this is hardly without precedent. As Jessie Donahue and her unfortunately named colleague Eric Trump wrote in their book Political Animals, Public Art in American Zoos and Aquariums, the art in zoos has explored the human relationship with the animal world in ways that the actual animal exhibits could not. Successive waves of animal artists have tried to capture the truth about animals and zoos as a space. At various times, the truth about animals has shifted from their anatomy to their energy to to their vulnerability to human predation, and so on. So these political scientists trace the shifts from elite patronage to democratised zoo art, from New Deal public funds, from naturalism to Art Deco, to representational, postmodern, ethnic and religious art in zoos. Most interestingly for our concerns, they narrate the shift when, due to legal threats and the rise of the welfare movement, zoos had to stop allowing visitors to touch their animals. An expectation of tactile contact that they then replaced not only with petting zoos, but also with collections of touchable sculptures and other art. As if in confirmation of Berger's thesis, they write, the new art encouraged visitors to come closer at a time when the real animals were being moved further away for their protection. But Abdullah's art, for me, works against this process. While his works are visually striking, part of their allure is their tactility, the remarkable detail of their carving that seems to compel you to touch them. You're not allowed to. To trace a finger across the hair or wool or skin, that makes you wonder, I know this is a gallery, but surely it would be okay if I just put my hand on the buffalo's head. I'll tell you a secret, you can go to a public park in Eastwick Park where a public work of the triceratops is installed and you are allowed to touch that one. Abdullah's sculptures give presence to an animality that might otherwise be inaccessible, invisible, untouchable, that perhaps should remain so, and yet whose reality, memory and fantasy are here made tangible. So Donahue and Trump also relate the intriguing story of the animalias, 19th century sculptors of scientifically accurate animals who used the zoo as a site for observation. Animalia artists perceive themselves, they write, as rugged members of the scientific establishment. Their twin goals were to create scientifically accurate representations of animals to get closer to the truth about animals and to preserve these animals visually for the sake of the larger preservation of the natural landscape of the United States and for human knowledge. Getting up close to the animals in the zoo often meant facing their ferocity and recalcitrance. They relay the story of one animalia who took an eagle home to sculpt it when a thief attempted to steal it. The anecdote, you can't go back. Okay. The anecdote suggested a lesson that Proctor Zoo patrons would have appreciated. The close study of wild animals was a risky business best left to the few in society fit to respect nature's wonders. For the rest, wild animals were most safely encountered through the artist's vision or behind the zoo walls. If the work of these 19th century animalias was a modality in which, in line with Berger's thesis, animal art was about the nostalgic capture of what was disappearing, I'm tempted to suggest that Abdullah might be characterised as a contemporary anti-animalia, a simultaneous inheritor and dissenter of this tradition who seeks not to capture the disappearing, but to enable meditation on those that are still present, whose zoologically informed sculptures in fact put their astonishing detail to work in order to bring into presence a different truth of animals, to be true not to their separate and objectified life in the wild, but to their complex entwinement with human lives, and to be true, moreover, to the animal's own capacity for dreaming. So let me conclude with one last piece of zoo marginalia, a final example from my own research in the history and philosophy of zoo biology and zoological gardens that might help further deepen this nexus of animals and art. The Swiss zoo director Heini Hedegaard, who directed Zurich Zoo and was hugely influential in making zookeeping around the world more professional and scientific, was not only concerned with the biological management and care of animals, but was fascinated by animal dreaming. He published 2 articles on the question of whether animals dream in the 1930s and again in the 1960s, summarising the scant available scientific literature on this topic and offering some of his own observations and speculations. He wrote that animal's dream can hardly be doubted today. Certainly, however, we don't know what the animal is dreaming. Will this door remain forever closed? In view of the insights gained by contemporary dream research thus far, perhaps even here, careful optimism is warranted. In this spirit of careful optimism, he speculated that on talking about some experiments with EEGs on dogs. These fascinating trials, as well as others, further lead us to the question of what the so-called raw material for dreaming is. It's generally accepted that it consists of memory and fantasy. With regard to the animal's memory, we need not waste words. The considerable recollective abilities of animals have been shown in countless experiments. He insists against the idea that animals don't have the same capacities for memory as human beings. And as to the capacity for fantasy, which probably also plays a role in dreaming, it is likewise beyond question, at least for the warm-blooded animals. For the cat at play, the paper wad or ball is not merely a dead object but something much more lively, perhaps its prey. The power of its vital fantasy allows the animal to see in its plaything all kinds of hidden qualities and possibilities which invite experimentation. So for Heidegger, the study of animals was a matter of understanding their own perspective, their Umwelt, of reconstructing their inner world, and most importantly, how they see humans within this world. In the context of the zoo, it was a matter of how to take the image of human beings from one as one of the enemy from whom they must always flee, and transform it into one of a friend who they might bring themselves to trust. I want to suggest finally that in addition to and beyond the science that Heidegger dreams might help us to open the door and answer these questions and respond to this task, the art of Abdul-Rahman Abdullah brings to our attention and experience the reality of this more than human dream world. Animal dreams put us in contact with a shared animality that is not just one of the body, of meat, of mechanical nature that we share, but one of imagination, of the world from animals' perspectives, their desires and goals, the wishes that they want to fulfill. In his remarkable book of Anthropology Beyond the Human that draws on his fieldwork with the runa of the Amazon in Ecuador, Eduardo Cohn writes of the work that dreams can do in opening up anthropocentric ideas. Dreams too, he says, are part of the empirical. They are a kind of real. They grow out of and work on the world, and learning to be attuned to their special logics and their fragile forms of efficacy helps reveal something about the world beyond the human. Likewise with Abdullah's dreamlike carvings of animals, his world stood still. Unlike Berger's zoo animals, Abdullah's animals are definitively not disappointing, and not less than we believed. Abdullah offers us animals that are more than we believed, more than we tend to expect, and in fact more than many might actually concede. I've sought to situate his art against Berger's thesis that our encounters with animals have become irreparably marginalised. It offers an alternative vision, in part through its own scenes and memories of comfort and marvel, of territory and slaughter, in part through its own magical realist dreams and images which remind us that the animal gaze through which we elaborate our humanity is not quite as extinct as some imagine. The gaze between human and animal might have been interrupted and rendered marginal, as Berger wrote, but it has not been irrevocably broken, has not been made irredeemable. It persists in the magic of these everyday and these staged encounters. It crisscrosses our institutions and dreams, our everyday life and our moments of grief, where filled with memory and affect, it offers the opportunity for reflection and meditation. We might often dream of animals in our imagery, our art and our stories, but it is just as certain that animals dream of us. Who are we in their eyes? What are their memories and visions of us? Where might their luck or good fortune lie? The seeds of encounter that Abdul-Rahman Abdullah so carefully crafts offer a site from which we can begin to ask such questions. Thank you.
That's something that you said earlier on about how classical art use of animals as symbolism, and that less so. And then a way to think this change more into the relationship you have and less about me to a certain
Yeah, it's not that the emphasis on symbolism and meaning has gone away, but there's definitely been I think, a historical change in which people have just become much more aware of animal life. Um, I mean, it's certainly there, and it's there in Abdullah's work as well. I think part of what's so fascinating about what he does is the way he ties together the symbolism and just the stark reality of the encounter. Um, yeah, but it becomes, I think, a lot harder and harder the more we know to think of animals in that sort of way in which they might represent a certain frame of mind or personal characteristic and all these sorts of things. And the growth of scientific knowledge about them, presents a certain different biological image. So and then the ways in which those biological images then come to relate to the remaining, cultural ones are part of what's the story of this recent art is, I think.
Okay, I'd like to invite you to on the wonderful talk. Hopefully, stay around a few minutes and enjoy tea and do you have any questions? Thank you, and thank you all for coming. The exhibition closes today, closes on Friday, it's the last day of the exhibition, and then we reopen the gallery for our next exhibition on the 14th of May. Quite different to what we have here, but I'm hoping to be